Let's talk about something most people instinctively misunderstand, the notion that being kind is always the right response. You've been told over and over again that niceness is a virtue, that turning the other cheek is noble. And in most situations among reasonable, reciprocal human beings, that's true. But here's the problem. The narcissist does not operate by the same moral or psychological framework. Your kindness to a narcissist isn't seen as a generous act. It's interpreted as a signal that you're willing to submit. And once they've picked up on that, the dynamic changes completely and irreversibly. The narcissist views relationships as a hierarchy. It's not a collaboration. It's a dominance game. They don't seek intimacy, they seek leverage. So when you're nice, when you offer them understanding, forgiveness, compassion, they think, good, I've got them trained. And this isn't paranoia, it's a hard psychological truth. Narcissism is at its core a compensatory pathology. It masks a deeply fragmented sense of self with a grandiose persona, one that requires constant external validation to survive. The narcissist feeds off that validation, and your niceness becomes the most delicious form of supply. And here's where it gets dangerous. Because your instincts as a psychologically healthy person will compel you to give benefit of the doubt, to soothe conflict, to see the best in people. But those instincts, which serve you beautifully in most of life, are weaponized in the narcissist world. They exploit the gap between your assumption of shared values and their calculated manipulation. You think you're building a bridge, they're mapping out your pressure points. This is why so many people caught in narcissistic relationships, romantic, professional, even familial, feel such intense cognitive dissonance. You keep thinking, if I'm just patient enough, kind enough, loving enough, they'll change. They'll see I'm different. But what you don't realize is that your kindness is being filed away as weakness. It emboldens them. It justifies their behavior. It teaches them that you'll tolerate more because you already have. There's a concept in behavioral psychology known as intermittent reinforcement. It's when unpredictable rewards strengthen a behavior more than consistent ones. Narcissists are masters of this. They give just enough kindness, just enough false hope to keep you engaged. And the more you pour in, the more they take. It becomes a cycle. Your niceness enables their pathology, and they will not stop because they see no reason to. Why would they when the system works in their favor? Now, some people might say, well, isn't it cruel to be anything but kind? Don't we all deserve grace? And to that I say, kindness without boundaries is not grace. It's self-betrayal. When you're nice to someone who manipulates, exploits, and gaslights you, you're not being moral, you're being complicit. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But if your goodness consistently gets you hurt, it's not goodness anymore. It's naivety, and worse, it feeds the very dysfunction you're trying to fix. There's a deeper philosophical issue here too. At what point does compassion become cowardice? When does the refusal to confront someone's destructive behavior stop being noble and start being self-destructive? That's a question everyone entangled with a narcissist must eventually face, because niceness in that context becomes a moral bypass. You're not avoiding conflict for peace. You're avoiding it because you're afraid. Afraid of being disliked, afraid of being alone, afraid of being the bad guy. And the narcissist can sense that. They smell fear like blood in the water. Important to remember, you are not obligated to be nice to someone who has made a habit of hurting you. Respect must be mutual. Empathy must be reciprocal. Otherwise, you're not in a relationship. You're in a performance. And every time you choose niceness over truth, you extend the narcissist stage. They keep acting, and you keep applauding, hoping the script will change. But it won't, because for them, it was never about truth to begin with. It was about control. You're not here to be someone's emotional fuel. You're not here to be drained, diminished, and discarded. You are here to live a life aligned with your values, your dignity, your boundaries. And the first step is recognizing that some people will see your kindness not as a gift, but as an opportunity to dominate, deceive, and destroy. So stop being nice to a narcissist. Be honest, be firm, be willing to walk away. Because in the end, real strength is not found in how long you can endure their chaos. It's found in your ability to choose yourself over their narrative, and that, in the truest sense, is the most moral thing you can do. Now let's examine something far more subtle and more insidious. Empathy, the very trait that society quite rightly teaches us to cultivate. The capacity to see and feel what another person is experiencing, it's a cornerstone of morality. Without it, cooperation would collapse, civilization itself would disintegrate into tribal brutality. But empathy, like any virtue, when divorced from discernment, becomes a liability. And that's what the narcissist understands in a way you don't. Most people assume that empathy is an inherently noble trait. But here's the reality. Empathy is only noble when it's exercised within the boundaries of truth and mutual responsibility. The narcissist doesn't relate to empathy as something to be valued. They see it as something to use, to wield. Your emotional attunement, your desire to soothe, to understand, to repair, is a weakness they will manipulate as easily as a puppeteer pulls strings. And they're good at it, because narcissists study you, not in a conscious, reflective way, but instinctively. They observe your tells, your triggers, your guilt. They listen for phrases like, "I just want peace," or "maybe I was too harsh." And every time you hesitate to defend yourself in the name of keeping the peace, they take note, they log it, they build a psychological playbook specifically tailored to your vulnerability. That's what makes this so profoundly damaging. You are not being exploited because you are weak in some fundamental way. Quite the opposite. You're being exploited because you care, because your emotional radar is finely tuned, and because you believe that if you can just understand the narcissist's pain, if you can just help them feel safe or seen, they'll stop hurting you. But that's the trap, because the narcissist isn't seeking healing, they're seeking control, and your empathy is the perfect mechanism to achieve it. They tell half-truths, spin stories about how others have wronged them, and present themselves as misunderstood victims, not because they are, but because they know it will activate your compassion. And the moment they've activated that compassion, they own the frame. You're no longer evaluating their behavior critically, you're rationalizing it, you're justifying what is in truth deeply manipulative conduct. This is why so many survivors of narcissistic abuse feel emotionally hijacked. They start to doubt their own reality. They feel cruel for setting boundaries. They feel selfish for expressing hurt. That's not an accident. That's a result of prolonged empathy manipulation. The narcissist uses your very humanity as a tool of control. And you don't realize it until your emotional bank account is empty and you're still being told you haven't done enough. And here's the deeper issue. When your empathy overrides your judgment, you become a participant in your own exploitation. That's not to blame the victim, it's to awaken the victim to a critical truth. You are not morally obligated to understand someone who weaponizes your kindness. You do not owe patience to someone who interprets it as permission to continue violating your emotional boundaries. You see, empathy without limits leads to codependency. It keeps you locked in a cycle where your identity becomes tied to fixing someone else's chaos. That's not compassion. That's self-erasure. And the narcissist thrives in that environment because the more you disappear, the more room they have to dominate. It becomes a psychological colonization where your instincts serve their pathology. So what's the alternative? It's not to become cold or indifferent. That's another extreme. The alternative is to practice wise empathy. Empathy with accountability. Compassion that includes you in the equation. When you feel yourself being pulled into the narcissist's orbit through pity or guilt, you need to pause and ask, whose needs are being met right now? Is this emotional exchange reciprocal, or am I being played like a violin for someone else's narrative control? When you shift from blind empathy to discerning empathy, everything changes. You start to recognize that some people do not want to be understood, they want to be obeyed. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to fix them. You stop trying to get them to see your perspective, because you realize they already do. They just don't care. And that ultimately is the bitter truth. The narcissist is not confused. They're not broken in a way you can mend. They're strategic. They're performative. They've learned that your empathy is the perfect tool to keep you invested while they continue their manipulation behind a mask of victimhood. But once you reclaim your empathy and pair it with discernment, you remove their power. You stop playing the role they assigned you, and you start becoming something far more dangerous to a narcissist than an enemy. You become someone they can no longer control. Let's talk about the concept of niceness. Because contrary to what you've been taught, being nice is not synonymous with being good. In fact, niceness, particularly when it's habitual, unexamined, or rooted in fear, can be one of the most dangerous traits a person carries, especially when entangled with a narcissist. See, when you're nice to a narcissist, you're not modeling virtue. You're offering compliance. You're signaling that you're willing to abandon your own values, your own intuition, and often your own dignity in order to avoid conflict, preserve the illusion of peace, or keep the relationship intact. And the narcissist sees that, they feel it, and most importantly, they exploit it. Narcissistic individuals operate within a psychological structure that's deeply hierarchical. In their world, there are dominators and there are the dominated. There are those who serve and those who are served. Power is the game and control is the reward. Now, when you show up to that dynamic with your hands open, with your boundaries soft, with your instincts muted by the compulsion to be nice, you're not diffusing the power imbalance. You're reinforcing it. You're confirming, silently but unmistakably, that they're in charge and you are not. And the more you comply, the more the abuse escalates. It doesn't necessarily start with overt cruelty. Often it begins with small requests, subtle manipulations, emotional guilt trips that are disguised as emotional need. And because you're nice, because you don't want to upset them, you give in. Again and again. You tolerate the criticism, you rationalize the gaslighting, you suppress your resentment and call it patience, and all the while you believe you're keeping the peace. But in reality, you're just feeding the machine. Because the narcissist's system thrives on your silence, on your self-sacrifice, on your willingness to be the container for their chaos. And with every moment that you choose nice over truth, you disappear just a little more. Your voice, your needs, your individuality. They erode under the pressure of maintaining an illusion. And that illusion is designed to keep you in your place. And you might ask, what's wrong with being nice? Well, here's the fundamental problem. Nice people conflate kindness with avoidance. They think that if they can just keep things smooth, if they don't rock the boat, the narcissist will stop the behavior. But narcissists don't respond to smoothness. They respond to structure, to consequence. They respect, in a twisted sense of the word, the person who refuses to play the game, the one who stops accommodating dysfunction, the one who says no and means it. Niceness becomes a mask, a way to hide fear, a way to avoid the uncomfortable work of confrontation, of self-assertion, of standing in the uncomfortable truth that sometimes love alone isn't enough to fix another human being. That some people don't want to be helped. They want to dominate. And if you keep showing up with softness when what's needed is strength, you're not just enabling them, you're endorsing their behavior. What's required is not cruelty, but clarity, not aggression, but assertiveness. Boundaries are not acts of hostility. They are declarations of self-respect. And when you begin to shift from nice to honest, from passive to principled, the narcissist will often escalate their tactics because the power structure you once upheld with your niceness is beginning to collapse. And that threatens the very core of their control. It's in that moment when the mask slips, when their rage surfaces, when the manipulations intensify, that you'll be tempted to revert, to go back to being nice, to smooth it over. But understand this, that temptation is not compassion, it's conditioning. And the only way to break it is to recognize that your niceness was never keeping the peace. It was simply prolonging the war. What must replace niceness is a deeper, more courageous form of moral responsibility, the willingness to face conflict in order to uphold truth, the capacity to endure discomfort in the name of self-integrity. That's what the narcissist fears. Not your anger, but your awakening, your refusal to participate, your conscious decision to no longer bend your will to the distorted needs of someone who has built their identity on your submission. So the next time you feel that pull to be nice, to stay quiet, to smile when you want to scream, to explain yourself endlessly in the hope of being understood, pause. Ask yourself, am I choosing peace, or am I choosing to be controlled? Because when you stop enabling the narcissist with your niceness, when you begin to draw the line in the sand, not out of rage, but out of deep self-respect, that's when the power begins to shift. One of the most insidious myths we've absorbed is that being nice is the same as being virtuous. That if you smile, comply, and never ruffle feathers, you're doing the right thing. But that's not virtue. That's avoidance. And more often than not, what we label as nice is actually a mask, one that hides fear, codependency, and a deeply rooted discomfort with standing up for ourselves. Let's be honest, most people who consistently act nice in the face of abuse aren't doing it because they're saints. They're doing it because they're scared. They're afraid of conflict, afraid of being disliked, afraid of what will happen if they assert themselves. And in the context of narcissistic abuse, that fear becomes the foundation of the entire dynamic. When you're in a relationship with a narcissist, romantic, familial, professional, it's not just a matter of misunderstanding. It's a battle of psychological frameworks. The narcissist is driven by control and validation. You, on the other hand, might be driven by harmony, connection, and acceptance. So what happens when these forces collide? You start giving, and they keep taking. And that imbalance grows rapidly, and your niceness, your reluctance to say no, to confront, to challenge, becomes the very mechanism that allows the narcissist to dominate. But the reason this continues isn't because you're too good. It's because your sense of self is often tied to the approval of others. That's codependency. The need for external validation to regulate your internal stability. Now here's the deeper issue. Codependency isn't compassion. It's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. You begin to think you're being loving by staying quiet, by absorbing blame, by fixing what you didn't break, but really, you're just disappearing. Slowly, willingly. And that disappearance is not a noble sacrifice. It's a psychological escape from the responsibility of selfhood. Narcissists are experts at identifying people like this. They can sense, often unconsciously, who will make themselves small, who will carry the emotional weight, who will flinch first. And they don't admire your niceness, they exploit it. Because to them, your inability to enforce boundaries doesn't signal kindness, it signals utility. You're useful when you're compliant, disposable when you're not. So let's be clear, being agreeable in a situation that demands strength is not moral high ground. It's often a symptom of an underdeveloped sense of self, one that was likely shaped in early life, perhaps in a family where love had to be earned, where peace was maintained at the cost of personal expression. In that environment, being nice wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy. And unfortunately, many adults carry that strategy into every subsequent relationship without realizing it no longer serves them. It traps them. That's why so many victims of narcissistic abuse feel confused. They believe they were doing everything right. They were accommodating, patient, forgiving. But instead of being met with respect or appreciation, they were met with more manipulation, more lies, more emotional violence. Why? Because what the narcissist respects, what any predator respects, is not submission. It's strength. And niceness, especially when it's compulsive, reads as weakness. To break this cycle, you don't need to become harsh or cruel. You need to become honest. Honest with yourself about why you're afraid of conflict. Honest about the emotional cost of keeping the peace. Honest about how much of your life has been spent managing someone else's reactions rather than expressing your own reality. Niceness, when it's authentic, when it's chosen, when it's paired with boundaries, that's grace. But niceness that's reactive, automatic, compulsive, that's fear. That's a strategy for not being abandoned, not being attacked, not being rejected. And that strategy, while it may have once kept you safe, is now destroying your ability to live a life rooted in integrity. So the question is not, are you being nice? The question is, are you being real? Are you showing up with truth, with courage, with the willingness to say, I will not abandon myself just to make you comfortable? Because when you stop masking your fear with niceness, when you let go of the illusion that compliance will earn you love, something powerful happens. You begin to reclaim yourself, your time, your energy, your dignity. You stop being a character in someone else's story and start writing your own. And the narcissist, they'll notice, they'll push back, they'll accuse you of being selfish, cold, changed. But that's not a sign you're doing something wrong. That's a sign the dynamic is breaking. That's a sign you're waking up. The truth is, your niceness was never protecting you. It was simply postponing the inevitable. And the day you choose courage over comfort, that's the day the healing begins.